Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. Let's talk photography, mainly image editing, and ask a question. What makes a good picture? I'm not sure that question is considered as often as I think it deserves. We tend to concentrate on the technicalities of the camera settings, and we do obsess sometimes with the image editing. But this question, what makes a good picture, is important in both of those two skills. Because we need to know what makes a good picture to effectively choose our subject, the viewpoint, and the composition at the taking stage. But if we shoot raw images, which most of us do these days, what makes a good picture is also a vital question we have to ask and know the answer to when we're sitting in front of our computer. Now, I'm willing to bet that there are thousands of great pictures sitting on computer hard drives everywhere, perhaps because the author hasn't seen the potential in that image thumbnail. Let me demonstrate with this image, which I've opened up into Camera Raw. Now, if you're a Lightroom user, the image editing in Adobe Camera Raw is going to be identical to Lightroom. So you can very easily follow on because it's the question that's the most important, not where a particular slider is located in the software. We need to know what makes a good picture so we know where we're heading. Now, I often refer to this as our image editing satellite navigation. Let's consider the image that I've got open here by first looking at the histogram at the top right. The first thing we'll notice about that is we don't have any straight lines on the left-hand side, which shows us the shadow areas. So even though the image looks fairly dark at the base, we haven't actually lost any of those shadow pixels. If we look over to the right, we see a similar thing there. On the highlight side, we see no straight edges right up at the far right, which indicates that the highlights are pretty good too. If we look just below the histogram, we can also see the technical details of the image that I shot. I've used 100 ISO, which is the lowest setting, so the noise in this image is going to be pretty good. 16 to 35mm zoom, used almost at its maximum width at 17mm. Almost certainly taken from a tripod using 1/100th of a second and f10. So from an image sharpness point of view, from foreground to background, we've got that too. So when we ask that question again, what makes a good picture, we look at this and we have to decide what we need to do to lift the picture from what we can see here to something we're willing to present to others. So what do we need to do? I'm going to crop the image just a little bit to put the horizon along the top third of the rule of thirds. I need to do something with the dark foreground, bringing up the detail and also the quality. Because we've shot a raw file late in the evening with the sun almost gone, we've got quite a heavy blue cast here, which is badly affecting the color of the entire image, so that needs to be addressed. We need to do something with the sky because the sky is obviously a weak point when we look at the solid base the image sits on. We also have a few problems in the sky with dust marks. This image was taken a little while ago, and as you can see, the sensor was probably overdue a clean, but it's no big deal working in Photoshop or Lightroom. So we begin with the global changes, the changes that are going to affect the entire image, but we're also going to need to do some strategic editing, and I'm going to suggest on the boats in the foreground because they're an important feature in the image. So let's make a start by maybe picking up the crop tool first. That's at the top right of the screen. Let's get started. Once we select the crop, we can see the rule of thirds. I can use this to do two things. Firstly, I can straighten the horizon just a little bit. If I click just outside, you can see a series of grids appear, and I can just rotate my image, and if I look carefully, I should be able to get this nicely straight, or certainly a lot better than it was. If I'd like to use a slightly different method here, I could go over to the right and select the angle tool here. Now I can just draw a line from there to there, say, and I'm saying to Adobe Camera Raw, that part should be straight. And as you see that little jump, you can see it's changed it, so I can be reassured that horizon is nicely level. I'm going to bring the top down a little bit so that top rule of thirds is a little bit closer to the horizon. Maybe I'll lose a little bit from the bottom, not much. This is all going to be personal, maybe a tiny amount from the left, just so I'm bringing the important parts into play. So we've got the rule of thirds that's working for us on that top line. We've got this boat, which is very, very close to that cross vertical and horizontal line. This one's a little bit off, but it's got interest all around here, so it's going to work for us. I'm going to hit the Enter key, Control 0 to fit the image on screen. So we're going to pick up from here. I think an important next step is going to be the colour balance, because I think that's going to influence us on what we do with the rest of those sliders. Now we can change this in a number of ways. We could go to the white balance option on the right hand side, and we could select one of the options we have here. I could choose cloudy, for example, and you can see that warms it up quite a bit. If I choose daylight, a little bit more warmth, but not a great deal. What I tend to do though is to leave it as shot, and I would pick up the eyedropper tool here, the white balance tool. The white balance tool is extremely powerful. I'm looking around the image at something which should be a neutral colour. If we look at the side of this aluminium boat, it really should be a little bit less blue than it is. And of course, if the colour balance is wrong in the blue spectrum, it's wrong elsewhere too. So I'm going to click on the side of that boat, just one click, and look at the difference that it's made. Now we don't have to stay with the settings that we now have in the temperature and tint. We still have our own personal choices. But to be honest, I think that's pretty accurate. I think the next thing I'm going to deal with are those dust spots in the sky. So I'm going to move my cursor onto the picture and click and drag using the spacebar to bring up the hand so I can bring the picture to the top right. We can see some of the marks there. But it's much easier to see if we pick up the healing brush. And from the healing brush, you'll notice that I've got a size set to 5, which is going to be a little small. So I'm going to use the square bracket keys to increase those sizes a little bit. You can see the feather is around 52, that's fine, and the opacity at 100. But I'm going to tick the box to visualize the spots, because now, although we've got quite a few of them, they're going to be dead easy to fix. So with a brush that's going to cover those little spots, if I just touch, they're fixed instantly. Now I'm going to spend just a few seconds doing the rest of these, but as you can see, it really doesn't take any skill. It doesn't take too long. I know these dust spots can be a bit painful at times, but they're a small price to pay for all the other advantages we gain with digital photography. So there you can see all the little dust marks that I had to fix using the healing brush. It looks rather a lot. How long did it take? 2 minutes? Hardly a big deal. So let's untick the visualize box and let's go back to the other tabs. We can do that from the top right of the screen here, but Control and the number 1 key is a shortcut if you care to use it. As you can see, it's taken me back to the basic tab and all of those beneath. I think the best advice I would give anyone going down these sliders in the basic tab is to just deal with the issues as you see them. If we look at this image, it looks as though we could do with dealing with the highlights, bringing them down, and maybe the shadows up a little bit. So let's give that a try. I'll drop the highlights down and I'll bring the shadows up. That's done a pretty good job. Maybe I'll come down and give a little vibrance here to make a little more of the colour in our shot. See the lovely quality coming through in the foreground now. That's quite strong. I'm also going to introduce some clarity. Clarity will increase the mid-range contrast, and we need that here. Now, how much you give is going to be a personal choice. I'm going to push it up about halfway along to the right, and we do create quite a bit of sparkle. As a result of that, I'm just going to go back over some of the other sliders, maybe a little more shadow. I don't think I need to touch the highlights. I'm pretty happy with the colour, although we can always experiment with a little more. Sometimes when we get to this sort of point, it's nice to have a timeout. In other words, sit back and before you go racing on, just take a good, hard, long look at the image. There are even times where we need to walk away for a little while, and if you want to do that, if you click the Done button down at the bottom right, all of the changes that we've put into this image will be saved into your raw thumbnail, which you could go back into Photoshop's Bridge anytime later and open it back up just as we see it here. Now, after a little bit of a timeout with this image, I have decided to just tweak the exposure a little bit. Remember, these are all going to be very personal things. But now I want to deal with that sky. To do that, I'm going to select a graduated filter. So I'm going to select that from the toolbox on the right. As soon as we click to select it, all of the options that we can change within that filter open up on the right hand side. So I want to affect my sky quite a bit. So I'm going to click and drag. You can see I'm just putting a nice little gradient over the horizon. Any changes we make here are going to be solid at the top, transparent at the base, and graduated in the middle. But I'm going to right click and reset all of the current settings that are in place on the right hand side. And I'm going to hit the V key just to hide that selection. The selection is still there and it's still doing its job. What I'd like to do here is now experiment by bringing down the highlights a little bit within that graduated filter and the exposure quite a bit, and now we're seeing some nice balance coming in with the sky in the foreground, maybe a bit of clarity, maybe even the little whites to give it a bit more sparkle. See how the image is beginning to balance nicely. What we can also do, we could apply another gentle graduated filter at the top and maybe introduce a little colour. If we want to do that, all we need to do is, well, we don't need to bring back the selection, which I'm going to do now with the V key, but it makes life easier for you to follow. I was going to say, all we need to do is to go to the top of the image, click and drag, and create another graduated filter. And here, if I wanted to put just a little bit of colour into that, I can do that if I scroll down to the bottom of the options here. This is the option that I'm looking for. When I click that, you can see all of the colours appear. So just for the minute, the saturation is maximum. So I'm just going to move along the top here. I'm looking at my picture and I'm trying to evaluate it. You see, I'm looking for something around there. maybe a little bit less than that, just a hint of blue. Maybe I'll just drop that exposure a little bit more. That's all, just to give that nice ending to the top of the image. Now, what I'm going to do is hit Control and the 1 key to take us back to the Basic tab. And I'm going to have just 30 seconds taking a look at my image to decide where I want to go next. Now, it is amazing what a timeout does, because I'm going to go back to my basics and I still want to bring the exposure down a bit, just a little bit more. I think I'm happy with that. But there is a bit of a weakness now on the left hand side of my image. It's pretty strong at the base, top, middle and the right hand side. So a good way to address that would be another graduated filter. So if I select the graduated filter option, click and drag in, right click within the bounding box and reset all of the settings, touching the V key to hide them so they're not in our eye line. Then I'm just going to tweak down the exposure on the left to give my picture that little bit more balance. And once I've done that, now I feel the need to do the same on the right, just in this area here. Now we're all going to choose something different, I know, so let me bring back the bounding box, click and drag. I'm not going to go too far. I'll double click and we can see exactly what the effect is that I'm about to do. You can just see a little bit of darkening on that edge. That's looking pretty good. Now, the one weakness I think is I need a bit more light on this boat and this boat. To do that, I'm going to use an adjustment brush. I need to zoom in. So I'm going to touch my Control key. We'll bring this boat up fairly large on screen. We can move an enlarged image around by just touching the space bar. As you can see, the hand appears and we can click and drag, which is pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is to select my brush. There you can see the brush. What are we dealing with here? We're more or less dealing with shadow detail. I suppose we could call it mid-tone, but I'm going to go over to the right. I'm going to tweak up the shadows, just a little bit of exposure. You can see the feather here is up at 60, that's fine. Density 100. I've got the flow fairly low. I can make my brush a little bigger and I can brush along this area to just bring some light into that boat. Now, if I've chosen to bring too much light into the boat, I can go and adjust these sliders. But for the moment, I'm just going to take a few moments to just go over the entire boat, and at times I'll probably bring the brush down small so I can get down to the edges, as you can see here. But it only takes a couple of minutes. Now, with the spinning round of the screen, I hope you'll agree that just raising the tones of those two boats makes the world of difference. You'll also notice though that I've had second thoughts about putting that delicate blue colour in the top of my image. So I went back to my graduated filter, clicked on the pin to bring it back to life, and I took the colour away, but I did just bring the exposure down a little bit. So I've got a similar effect, and this is why sometimes we need a little time to look at the image to be able to make up our mind. Now, I've noticed that my video is fast approaching the 20-minute mark, so I don't want to bore you to death with what we're doing here. But if you look at the foreground, you can see that the wetness between the sand or the mud there almost acts like fingers pointing in from the right towards the centre, from the bottom left towards the boat more or less in the centre. What I'd like to do is to try to just lift the tones in those strategic areas. To do that, I'm going to use exactly the same technique that I used on the two boats. I'm going to select my adjustment brush. I'm going to increase the shadows a little bit and the exposure, and I'm going to paint over those areas quite carefully, and I'll come back when it's completed because the technique is no different to the boat. With my image opened up into Photoshop, you may notice that the boat, which was half in and half out of the frame on the right hand side, is now gone. I've removed that using content aware fill, a very quick and easy job. Lots of videos of mine include this particular technique, so I won't go over that here in the interests of keeping this video as short as possible. I've burned down the boat a little bit in the distance in that little bay up above the big boat. And I think the only thing I'd like to do to complete this is a little bit of strategic colour using the sponge tool. So selecting that from the toolbox, I want the sponge tool at the bottom of those three. I need to set it from the options to saturate. 10% usually works quite nicely, and all I want to do is to just add a little bit of colour. Not much, just a little bit in the centre of the frame, a little bit round the sun, just to drag our emphasis right to the place I want you to look. So here we can take a look back at the original untouched picture. And I think as we move from this picture to the one we created, you can see what I mean when I say that what makes a good picture is a good question to ask ourselves all the way through the photographic process, but it's certainly vital at the image editing stage. My apologies for saying this on practically every video, but if you are watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to my channel, hit the notification bell and click the all bell to make sure you're informed whenever I post a new video. What I'm also trying to do with the videos that I post is to create a link to other videos where I think they're relevant to what we're viewing here. I'll see you next time.